Welcome to Sleepy Centuries. Tonight, we'll be drifting through one of the most sweeping and transformative periods in human history, the Second World War. A tale of nations, leaders, secrets, and sorrow, and ultimately, the quiet resilience of ordinary people. So lie back, close your eyes, and let the story carry you gently through time. This is the full story of World War II, told in 10 soft chapters. It all began not with a battle, but with a silence that settled over Europe in 1918, like the hush after a great storm. The First World War had ended, not with victory parades and jubilant cries of triumph, but with exhaustion. The world had bled. Over 16 million lives were lost. Empires that had ruled for centuries had crumbled into dust. The Austro-Hungarian Empire vanished. The Ottoman Empire fractured. The German Kaiser fled into exile. Soldiers returned from the trenches changed, not just physically, but in spirit. Mud, gas, and the endless roar of artillery had reshaped them. Cities were shattered, fields littered with the broken steel of war machines and the silent memories of those who would not come home. In Paris, the victors gathered to sign peace, but peace came at a price, and not just to those who lost. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, was meant to bring stability, but instead it sowed seeds of resentment that would take root and grow in shadow. Germany was burdened with blame for the war, forced to pay enormous reparations, stripped of territories, and humiliated before the world. The German people, already weary from hunger and war, now faced poverty, inflation, and humiliation. Their currency collapsed. A loaf of bread could cost a wheelbarrow of banknotes. Mothers burned money for warmth because it was cheaper than coal. In the cafes of Berlin, whispers of betrayal filled the air, the belief that Germany had not lost the war on the battlefield, but had been stabbed in the back at home by politicians and profiteers. It was a dangerous narrative, and it would soon find a voice. But it wasn't just Germany that trembled beneath the weight of the post-war world. Italy, though on the winning side, felt overlooked and betrayed by the peace treaties. Its people were angry. In the countryside, black-shirted men began marching, chanting slogans of strength, unity, and revival. Their leader, Benito Mussolini, a former socialist turned nationalist, promised to restore Italy to greatness, and the people listened. By the early 1920s, fascism had found its first stronghold. Further east, in Russia, a different revolution had already shaken the world. The Bolsheviks, under Lenin, had seized power in 1917 and pulled Russia out of the First World War. But peace didn't follow. Civil war engulfed the country. By the time the Soviet Union was born, millions had perished, and a new kind of rule had emerged, one built not on royalty or democracy, but on ideology. A government that believed in total control. And though Lenin would die in 1924, another man would soon rise, quiet, watchful, ruthless, Joseph Stalin. And yet, despite all this unrest, the 1920s seemed, on the surface, to shimmer with promise. The decade was bright in the cities of the West. In New York, the lights of Broadway sparkled. Jazz danced through the streets. Skyscrapers climbed toward the heavens. In Paris, artists and writers gathered in cafes, dreaming of a world without war. Even in Berlin, a cultural renaissance briefly bloomed. The Weimar Republic, fragile though it was, nurtured an explosion of art, music, and thought. Cabarets glowed through the nights. Science and cinema pushed boundaries. But beneath it all, beneath the laughter and music, something uneasy stirred, a sense that the peace was thin, brittle, temporary. Then came 1929. The American stock market crashed. The Great Depression began. Banks failed. Businesses shuttered. Unemployment soared. What began in New York spread across the globe like a sickness. In Germany, still struggling under the weight of Versailles, and now crushed by economic collapse, desperation took hold. People waited in soup lines. Children went barefoot in winter. The democratic government, already mistrusted, began to fracture under pressure. And in this chaos, voices of extremism grew louder. In beer halls and rallies, men who once fought in the trenches spoke of betrayal, of pride, of revenge. They found fertile ground among the wounded and the weary. One of them, a former soldier with a sharp moustache and a sharper tongue, had already tried to seize power in a failed coup in 1923. He had gone to prison, written a book, and returned with a clearer plan. His name was Adolf Hitler. But in 1930, he was still only a figure at the edge of politics. The world did not yet understand how deeply his words would take root. At the same time, Japan, an island nation with few resources and many ambitions, began its own march toward empire. It looked to Manchuria, to China, to the Pacific, and dreamed of dominion. The 1930s were not defined by a single moment, but by a slow, quiet unraveling. Agreements were made and broken. Armies were rebuilt. Old rivalries rekindled. Leaders gave speeches that stirred the blood. Some called for peace. Others called for purity, for destiny, for war. The League of Nations, created to prevent another global conflict, stood by helplessly as one act of aggression followed another. Ethiopia was invaded. Spain fell into civil war. China burned. And through it all, ordinary people tried to live, to plant crops, to raise families, to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, the worst was behind them, that the horror of 1914 to 1918 had taught the world a lesson too terrible to repeat. But the truth was, it hadn't. The storm was coming again. While the world slept uneasily through the 1930s, shadows lengthened across Europe and Asia, and in those shadows, dangerous ambitions grew bold. In Germany, a nation still carrying the scars of defeat and humiliation, a new leader had stepped into the spotlight. Adolf Hitler, once a fringe agitator, now spoke with the full authority of the German Chancellorship. When he was appointed in 1933, many still believed he could be contained, that he would be tamed by the responsibilities of office or outmaneuvered by older, more experienced politicians. But Hitler had no intention of being controlled. Within months, he seized emergency powers after the mysterious Reichstag fire, dismantling the democratic framework of the Weimar Republic. Opposition parties were outlawed. Dissenters were silenced or disappeared. Books were burned in public squares. The Gestapo, a secret police force, watched from the shadows. Germany, once hopeful of rebuilding, now turned its face towards something darker, a promise of unity and power, built on fear and lies. The swastika was raised high. Public loyalty to the Nazi regime became not just expected, but required. Children joined youth organizations that indoctrinated them with ideas of racial superiority and obedience. Propaganda flooded every newspaper, every radio broadcast, every schoolroom. Jews, who had lived in Germany for centuries, were now labeled enemies of the state. The Nuremberg laws stripped them of citizenship, banned them from professions, and forbade them from marrying non-Jews. Anti-Semitic hatred, once whispered, now echoed through streets and was written into law. Businesses were boycotted, synagogues burned, and as the years passed, the noose grew tighter. But Hitler's ambitions didn't end with ideology. He believed Germany had been unfairly shackled by the Treaty of Versailles, denied the right to defend itself, robbed of territory, shamed on the world stage. He vowed to reverse it all. The rearmament of Germany began in secret, then in the open. Factories built tanks and aircraft under the guise of civilian production. The army swelled beyond its legal limits. In 1936, Hitler sent troops into the Rhineland, a region that had been demilitarized after World War I. It was a direct violation of the treaty. France and Britain condemned it, but did nothing. And in Berlin, Hitler took note. The world, it seemed, would tolerate more than he expected. Meanwhile, in Italy, Benito Mussolini watched with admiration and envy. His fascist regime, now firmly in control since the early 1920s, had launched brutal campaigns in Africa, seeking to rebuild the glories of ancient Rome. In 1935, Italian forces invaded Ethiopia. The Ethiopian army, poorly equipped and lacking modern weaponry, was quickly overwhelmed. The League of Nations, tasked with maintaining global peace, imposed sanctions, but they were half-hearted and ineffective. The message was clear: boldness would go unpunished. And across the vast expanse of Asia, Japan pursued its own imperial dreams. In 1931, it had already taken Manchuria, establishing a puppet state called Manchukuo. The international community protested, but again, no real action followed. Emboldened, Japan continued pushing deeper into China. In 1937, full-scale war broke out between the two nations. Cities burned, millions fled. In Nanjing, Japanese troops committed one of the war's most horrific atrocities, a massacre that left tens of thousands dead and countless others brutalized. The world watched. Some condemned, few intervened. Back in Germany, Hitler's vision expanded. Austria, his birthplace, was next. He claimed that Germans and Austrians were one people, and in March 1938, without a single shot fired, Austria was absorbed into the Third Reich, in what became known as the Anschluss. German troops marched into Vienna to cheering crowds. There was no resistance. Again, Britain and France expressed concern. Again, they did nothing. Then came Czechoslovakia. In the mountainous region of the Sudetenland lived a large population of ethnic Germans. Hitler demanded it be handed over, claiming they were being mistreated. The Czech government refused. It was a sovereign nation, and the Sudetenland was vital to its defenses. But Hitler pushed, and at the Munich conference in 1938, Britain's Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, eager to avoid war, struck a deal. Without Czechoslovakia's input, the Sudetenland was handed to Germany in exchange for a promise of peace. Chamberlain returned to London, declaring, "Peace for our time." But peace, in truth, was already slipping away. Within 6 months, Germany took the rest of Czechoslovakia. This was no longer about protecting Germans or righting the wrongs of Versailles. It was conquest. And at last, Britain and France began to understand that Hitler would not be satisfied. He did not want justice. He wanted empire. And then came Poland. Throughout 1939, Hitler made demands, first for the return of the city of Danzig, then for a land corridor connecting Germany to East Prussia. Poland refused. Britain and France pledged to defend Polish independence, but Hitler had one more surprise. In August, the world was stunned when Germany and the Soviet Union, two bitter ideological enemies, signed a non-aggression pact. But it was more than that. In secret, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact included a plan to divide Eastern Europe between them. Poland would be carved up. The stage was now fully set. But even now, as the storm clouds gathered, many hoped it would pass. Some believed Hitler would stop at Poland. Others clung to the belief that diplomacy could still prevail, that another war like the last was unthinkable. But the time for belief was ending. The machine had been built. The pieces were in place. And the world was about to wake once more to the sound of marching boots. In the early hours of September, 1939, under a dull, clouded sky, German troops surged across the Polish border. Columns of tanks rolled over quiet country roads. Stuka dive bombers screamed through the air, their sirens engineered to terrorize. Explosions echoed across fields and forests, as Polish towns and cities were struck with overwhelming force. This was Blitzkrieg, lightning war, and it was unlike anything the world had seen before. It combined speed, precision, and brute strength. German tanks, infantry, and aircraft worked in ruthless coordination, cutting off communication lines, surrounding defenders, and overwhelming them with firepower. Within hours, it was clear this wasn't a limited skirmish. This was invasion, cold and deliberate. Hitler had decided. There would be no more waiting. No more negotiations. The war had begun. Across Europe, radios crackled with disbelief. At first, there was confusion. Perhaps it was a misunderstanding, a border clash, a bluff. But as the hours passed, the truth became undeniable. The German war machine was in motion, and Poland was being crushed beneath its weight. Britain and France, bound by treaty to defend Polish sovereignty, issued an ultimatum: withdraw or face war. Germany did not answer, and so, on September 3rd, 1939, 2 days after the invasion, Britain and France declared war on Nazi Germany. The words were spoken solemnly, broadcast over the airwaves into a world still haunted by the last great conflict. For many, it was surreal, as if history had folded back on itself. Less than 21 years after the end of the First World War, Europe was once again at war. But there was no immediate clash between the great powers. After the declarations, Britain and France did not charge into Germany. Instead, there was a strange, uneasy stillness. This period came to be known as the Phony War. British troops were sent to France and dug defensive lines along the border, waiting for an attack that never came. Civilians built air raid shelters, blacked out their windows, and listened to the ticking clock of war. But the front was quiet. In Berlin, Hitler took this in stride. He had gambled that the West would not interfere in Poland, and though war had been declared, he still hoped that actual fighting could be avoided. Meanwhile, Poland was left to face the storm alone, and on September 17th, another blow fell. From the east, Soviet forces crossed into Polish territory, honoring their secret agreement with Germany. Polish resistance, already struggling against the German onslaught, now found itself crushed between two immense forces. In less than 5 weeks, the country was defeated. Its government fled into exile. Its territory was divided between two hostile powers. The West had declared war, yes, but it had done nothing to save Poland. This was the first bitter lesson of the new war. Declarations meant little without action, and Hitler, watching the silence from the Western Front, began to plan his next moves. In occupied Poland, repression began almost immediately. Intellectuals, teachers, and leaders were arrested and executed. Entire communities were uprooted. Jewish populations, already targeted under Nazi ideology, were forced into ghettos, walled sections of cities where overcrowding, starvation, and disease ran rampant. But for now, the world's attention drifted elsewhere, waiting for the next move. Winter came, and with it a new front emerged. The Soviet Union, now emboldened by its pact with Hitler, invaded Finland in late November 1939. The Finns, vastly outnumbered and outgunned, mounted a fierce and stubborn defense. In forests blanketed with snow, ski troops launched daring attacks. For months, the Red Army suffered heavy casualties, its progress slowed by the bitter cold and Finland's determination. Though Finland eventually agreed to cede territory, the war had exposed the weaknesses of the Soviet military. Hitler, watching closely, took note. Back in Germany, preparations were already underway. The time for caution was ending. Hitler's next targets were the neutral countries that formed the northern corridor to the Atlantic, Denmark and Norway. In April 1940, German forces launched a surprise invasion. Denmark fell in a single day. Norway, more rugged and distant, fought longer but was soon occupied. The move secured vital iron ore shipments and access to naval bases, crucial for the coming war at sea. The Allies had been caught off guard, once again. Now, with Scandinavia under control, Hitler turned his attention westward. The invasions that followed came swiftly, one after another. Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, all neutral, all confident, until now, that their neutrality might protect them. On May 10th, 1940, German forces launched a coordinated assault across Western Europe. While Allied forces anticipated an attack through Belgium, much like in the First World War, the Germans had prepared something far more daring, an armored thrust through the Ardennes forest, a region thought to be too difficult for tanks. The plan worked with terrifying precision. Panzer divisions broke through weak points, drove deep into France, and encircled entire armies. Communications collapsed, bridges were destroyed, confusion reigned. By late May, British and French troops were trapped along the northern coast of France, surrounded by advancing German forces. What followed next became one of the most dramatic rescues in military history: the evacuation at Dunkirk. Over 9 days, more than 330 soldiers were rescued from the beaches, ferried across the English Channel by a flotilla of military vessels, fishing boats, and civilian yachts. The skies thundered with German aircraft, and the beaches burned with fire and chaos, but they made it out, battered, but alive. France, however, was collapsing. Paris was declared an open city and fell without a fight. On June 20, 1940, France officially surrendered. In just 6 weeks, one of the world's great military powers had been defeated. Hitler stood in silent triumph, visiting the city he had once only dreamed of seeing under German control. In a carefully staged moment, he stood before the Eiffel Tower, a symbol of his conquest. The world looked on in stunned silence. Britain now stood alone. Across the Channel, the British Isles braced for invasion. Hitler believed that Britain, humiliated and isolated, would seek peace. But he underestimated the resolve of the British people, and of one man in particular, Prime Minister Winston Churchill. In speeches that echoed through history, Churchill vowed never to surrender. Britain would fight in the fields, in the streets, on the beaches, and it would not yield. Germany began preparing for an air campaign designed to crush British resistance. The skies would soon fill with fire, but for now, the world held its breath, watching and waiting. The war had only just begun, but its shape was already clear. No longer a regional dispute, no longer a question of borders or treaties. This was a global conflict in the making, and there would be no quick end. The summer of 1940 settled heavily over Europe, not with peace but with fear. The fall of France had sent shockwaves through the continent. Just weeks earlier, the idea that one of the most powerful and storied militaries in Europe could collapse so swiftly seemed impossible. Now it was fact. Nazi flags flew over Paris, and German troops marched through cobbled streets that had once echoed with defiance. The French government had signed an armistice, and what remained of its military would serve under a new, collaborationist regime based in the town of Vichy. France was divided, not just geographically, but spiritually. Some would choose resistance, others, survival through submission. And all the while, across the narrow strip of sea, Britain remained unconquered, defiant, and now utterly alone. To Adolf Hitler, Britain was the last major obstacle to unchallenged domination of Western Europe. If the island nation could be brought to heel, either through diplomacy or force, the Reich's western flank would be secure, and his attention could shift to greater ambitions in the east. Initially, Hitler hoped Britain would see reason, offering them what he called generous peace terms, a chance to end the war and preserve their empire. But Winston Churchill, newly appointed as Prime Minister, had no intention of making peace with tyranny. His speeches were resolute, his tone unwavering. "We shall fight on the beaches," he had declared. "We shall never surrender." These were not words for theatre. They were the voice of a nation preparing for its most perilous hour. Realizing Britain would not yield, Hitler turned to a more brutal strategy: invasion. Operation Sea Lion, the German plan to land troops on British soil, required one critical step: control of the skies. Without air superiority, any attempt to cross the English Channel would result in disaster. And so began the Battle of Britain, an air war unlike anything the world had witnessed before. In July 1940, the Luftwaffe, Germany's air force, began its campaign. At first, their targets were military, radar stations, airfields, and aircraft factories. The plan was methodical: destroy the Royal Air Force in the air, cripple its ability to respond, and then bomb Britain into submission. But the RAF, though outnumbered, was not unprepared. Thanks to a pioneering radar system, They could detect incoming raids early and scramble fighters to intercept. And their pilots, a mix of British, Canadian, Polish, Czech, and others, flew with unmatched courage. The Spitfire and the Hurricane became legends, symbols of resistance in the skies. As the weeks passed, the fighting intensified. Dogfights erupted high above southern England, contrails weaving across the blue like frozen scars. Bombers unleashed their loads over towns and cities. Villages once untouched by war now echoed with sirens and gunfire. Then, on August 24th, a German bombing raid accidentally struck civilian areas in London. In retaliation, the RAF bombed Berlin. Enraged, Hitler shifted tactics. No longer would the Luftwaffe target military sites alone. The cities of Britain would now bear the brunt of the assault. And so began the Blitz. Night after night, waves of German bombers filled the sky. London became the primary target. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble. Fires raged uncontrollably, casting eerie orange glows over the Thames. Children were evacuated to the countryside. Families huddled in shelters. Underground stations turned into makeshift homes. The rhythm of life shifted, daylight for work, darkness for fear, and yet, the British spirit did not collapse. Firefighters battled blazes amid falling debris. Neighbors shared rations, sang songs, told stories by candlelight. Even as landmarks were struck, the House of Commons, St. Paul's Cathedral narrowly spared, morale held. The BBC broadcast steady news updates. Churchill's voice thundered through radios, and the RAF fought back with relentless tenacity. By October, it was clear the German plan had failed. The RAF had not been broken. British industry continued to function. Civilian morale, though tested, remained. Operation Sea Lion was postponed indefinitely, then quietly abandoned. For the first time in the war, Hitler had been denied. The Battle of Britain marked not only a military turning point, but a psychological one. The myth of German invincibility was shattered. It proved that the Axis could be resisted. It offered hope, not just to Britain, but to all of occupied Europe. But even as the skies quieted, the war evolved. The Atlantic Ocean became a new battleground. German U-boats, sleek, silent, and deadly, hunted Allied convoys carrying supplies from America to Britain. Merchant ships traveled in groups, guarded by destroyers, but the losses were staggering. Entire convoys vanished beneath the waves. British cities faced food shortages, rationing tightened. Codebreakers at Bletchley Park worked tirelessly to decipher German naval communications. Their success in cracking the Enigma cipher would prove vital in the years to come. But in 1940 and 1941, the Battle of the Atlantic remained a deadly gamble. And while Britain endured, across the European continent, Nazi control solidified. In France, resistance movements began to take shape, small at first, fragmented and fragile, but determined. Saboteurs cut train lines, printed underground newspapers, and gathered intelligence. In the Netherlands, Denmark, Norway, occupied lands found their own forms of quiet rebellion. But for now, the Axis dominated the map. Italy had joined the war on Germany's side in June 1940, opening new fronts in North Africa and the Balkans. Mussolini dreamed of conquest, but his campaigns stumbled. German forces would soon be required to prop up his faltering ambitions. Behind the front lines, a darker element of Nazi policy began to unfold. Jews across occupied Europe were rounded up and confined to ghettos, walled-off sections of cities where disease, starvation, and overcrowding were the norm. The full horror of what was to come was not yet known, even to many within the German ranks. But the machinery was being constructed. Laws grew harsher, freedoms vanished, families were torn apart. Rumors spread, but few believed the full extent of what was happening. The world's attention was fixed on battles, not on borders of wire and fear. As 1940 drew to a close, the war had already transformed the world. Maps were redrawn, alliances tested, and millions displaced. What had begun with a blitzkrieg across Poland had expanded into a conflict without boundaries. fought in the skies above London, the forests of Finland, the waters of the Atlantic, and the deserts of Libya. Yet for all the fire and fury, a strange truth remained. The war, in many ways, was still young. The deadliest years were still to come. The alliances not yet fully formed. The great offensive still being planned. But in the hearts of millions, one thing had changed. The war had become personal. It wasn't just about leaders or treaties anymore. It was about homes destroyed, families separated, letters never answered. It was about children sleeping in underground shelters, mothers lining up for rationed milk, fathers joining the home guard with rusty rifles and fierce pride. The war had come home, and the world would never be the same. While Europe burned and Britain held the line against German bombs and blockades, far across the world, another empire had begun its own brutal expansion. In the vast waters of the Pacific and the sprawling lands of East Asia, Japan was following a path of conquest rooted in ambition, necessity, and an unshakable belief in its imperial destiny. For decades, Japan had transformed itself from an isolated island nation into a modern industrial power, but it lacked one thing vital to its survival: resources. Oil, rubber, iron, and coal were all in short supply, and as the 1930s unfolded, Japan saw itself encircled by foreign colonial powers in the region. Britain, the United States, the Netherlands, they all held strategic islands, ports, and trade routes. To the militarists, now dominating Tokyo, Japan's survival and greatness could only be secured by taking these resources by force. Expansion was no longer a dream, it was a plan in motion. By 1937, Japan had already invaded China. What began as an incident near the Marco Polo Bridge erupted into a full-scale war. Chinese cities fell one after another: Beijing, Shanghai, and then Nanjing. In the old capital of China, Japanese troops committed one of the most horrific atrocities of the 20th century. Over 6 weeks, soldiers went on a rampage of killing, looting, and sexual violence. Tens of thousands of civilians were murdered, perhaps more. The international community protested, but Japan pressed on, convinced of its righteousness and determined to conquer all of China. And yet, the war in China dragged on longer than expected. The Chinese nationalist government refused to surrender. Resistance hardened. Japanese forces became bogged down, stretched thin across a vast and hostile land. To solve this, Tokyo's eyes turned southward, to the Dutch East Indies for oil, to British Malaya for rubber, and to the Philippines, then under American control. But there was a problem. The United States had begun to push back, economically, if not yet militarily. In 1940, America imposed embargoes on materials vital to Japan's war machine: steel, scrap metal, aviation fuel. Then came the most severe blow of all, an embargo on oil. Without oil, Japan's navy would grind to a halt, its tanks would freeze, its aircraft grounded. The US demanded that Japan withdraw from China as a condition for lifting the embargo, but for the Japanese government, this was unacceptable. To abandon the Chinese conquest would be to admit defeat and sacrifice years of national ambition. Instead, Japan began preparing for war. While diplomats in Tokyo and Washington exchanged final messages, military planners worked in secret on a bold strategy. If Japan was to seize the resources it needed across Southeast Asia, it would first need to cripple the one power that could stop it: the United States Navy. And so, they looked to Hawaii. On the quiet morning of December 7th, 1941, as the sun rose over the Pacific, waves of Japanese aircraft roared across the sky above Pearl Harbor. The American base, unaware and unprepared, was plunged into chaos. Bombs struck battleships still moored in harbor. Aircraft were destroyed before they could take off. The USS Arizona exploded violently, sending fire and debris into the air. More than 2,000 American service members were killed in less than 2 hours. Smoke billowed, oil burned on the surface of the water, and the world shifted. The attack was meant to knock the United States out of the Pacific quickly, to buy Japan the time it needed to seize Southeast Asia and fortify it against counterattack. But the result was something far greater than the planners in Tokyo had anticipated. The very next day, December 8th, the United States declared war on Japan. 4 days later, Germany and Italy, bound by treaty, declared war on America. What had been a global war in all but name was now official. The world was fully at war. In the weeks that followed Pearl Harbor, Japan launched a rapid and devastating campaign across the Pacific. The Philippines, Malaya, Hong Kong, Burma, the Dutch East Indies, all fell in swift succession. British forces were overwhelmed. American and Filipino troops fought bravely, but were forced into retreat. Singapore, considered one of the most impregnable fortresses in the British Empire, surrendered in February 1942, shocking the world. The Japanese advance seemed unstoppable. From the jungles of Burma to the shores of New Guinea, the rising sun flag flew over newly conquered lands. Allied prisoners were taken in the tens of thousands, many of whom would face years of brutality, starvation, and forced labor. But even as Japan expanded its empire, cracks began to show. The resources it so desperately needed now had to be shipped across vast distances through seas increasingly watched by Allied submarines. The people in the occupied territories did not always greet the Japanese as liberators, as Tokyo propaganda had hoped. Guerrilla movements sprang up and resentment simmered. Meanwhile, in the United States, a massive industrial mobilization was underway. Warships, planes, tanks, factories began producing them at a rate the world had never seen. Millions of men volunteered or were drafted. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers. The American economy, still recovering from the Great Depression, was transformed into a wartime engine. And in early 1942, the tide slowly began to shift. At sea, the Japanese fleet was still powerful, but its advantage was not unbreakable. In May, the Battle of the Coral Sea became the first naval engagement in which aircraft carriers fought each other, without the ships themselves ever coming into direct contact. The result was a tactical draw, but it halted Japan's advance toward Australia. Then came June, and the Battle of Midway. With intelligence gained by cracking Japanese codes, the U.S. Navy ambushed the Japanese fleet near a small atoll in the Central Pacific. 4 Japanese carriers were sunk. It was a stunning blow from which the Japanese Navy would never fully recover. Midway marked a turning point, not only in the Pacific theater, but in the psychological war as well. For the first time, Japan had been decisively defeated. For the first time, the tide had turned. But turning the tide would take time. The Pacific was vast, and each island was a fortress. The strategy that emerged was one of island hopping, bypassing heavily fortified positions, capturing nearby islands, building airfields, and pushing ever closer to the Japanese mainland. This meant brutal fighting in hostile environments. In the Solomon Islands, on the island of Guadalcanal, American and Japanese forces clashed for 6 grueling months. Rain, disease, and hunger took nearly as many lives as bullets. In the jungles of New Guinea, Australian and American troops pushed back against fierce resistance. Every inch of progress was bought with blood. By 1943, the pattern had begun to shift in favor of the Allies. Supplies, men, and firepower poured across the ocean, and yet the war was far from over. For Japan, defeat was not an option. The code of Bushido, the warrior's way, encouraged sacrifice and honor unto death. Surrender was seen not just as weakness, but as disgrace. Japanese soldiers fought with ferocity, often refusing to give up even when surrounded. Kamikaze pilots would later emerge, willing to give their lives in suicide attacks against Allied ships. It became clear that every step toward Japan would grow harder, and as the Pacific War raged, it had become inseparable from the larger global conflict. The Soviet Union, Britain, and the United States, now united in a vast alliance, began coordinating their efforts across continents. Supplies moved in convoys from America to Britain, From Britain to the Soviet front, strategies were debated in war rooms and embassies. Plans were made for the eventual liberation of Europe, but everyone understood that the Pacific would remain a crucible of its own, an ocean-sized battlefield filled with islands, jungles, and the determined resistance of an empire that would not yield easily. Even as victories came, there were costs. Cities destroyed, civilians caught in the middle, prisoners who vanished into labor camps. And above it all, the terrible knowledge that each step forward brought the world closer not only to victory, but to a reckoning with the full horror that had been unleashed. The war in the Pacific had begun with the thunder of bombs over Pearl Harbor. It would not end until fire fell from the sky again. But that moment was still years away. For now, the islands burned, the ships clashed, and the world watched as the United States, once distant and neutral, now stepped fully into its role, not just as a participant in the war, but as one of the forces that would shape how it ended. By the summer of 1941, the shape of the war was already global, but its heart was about to shift dramatically. Adolf Hitler, confident in his swift victories across Western Europe and buoyed by the apparent collapse of French and British resistance, turned his gaze eastward toward the vast expanses of the Soviet Union. For Hitler, the invasion of the Soviet Union was not just a strategic decision, it was ideological. He believed that the Slavic peoples were inferior, that communism was a threat to be destroyed, and that the lands of the East, rich in farmland and resources, should be seized for German living space. Lebensraum, as he called it. In his mind, it would be a swift campaign. The Red Army, still reeling from Stalin's brutal purges of its officer corps and its poor showing in Finland, seemed weak and unprepared. Germany would strike, overwhelm, and occupy before the winter came. That was the plan. On June 22, 1941, with the first light of dawn, that plan began. In the largest military invasion in history, more than 3 million German soldiers surged across the Soviet border in an operation codenamed Barbarossa. The front stretched from the Baltic Sea in the north to the Black Sea in the south. German tanks rolled across the plains, fighter planes darkened the skies, and cities fell into chaos. The Red Army was caught off guard. Entire divisions were surrounded and destroyed. Thousands of Soviet aircraft were destroyed on the ground in the opening days. Civilians, stunned and terrified, fled eastward as fast as their feet could carry them. Towns were abandoned, homes burned, and the countryside swallowed in smoke. In those first weeks, it seemed Hitler's confidence had been well placed. The Germans advanced rapidly, capturing Minsk, Smolensk, and pushing toward Kiev. Soviet casualties mounted into the millions. Prisoners were taken in vast numbers, marched westward in long columns with little food or water. But the further the Wehrmacht pushed into Soviet territory, the more their supply lines stretched, the more resistance stiffened, and the more the terrain began to turn against them. Soviet generals, though caught off guard, quickly adapted, and above all, the Soviet people began to rally in defense of their homeland. Stalin, caught in disbelief by the attack, at first disappeared from public view, but when he re-emerged, it was with a voice of grim determination. Factories were moved east of the Ural Mountains, far from the reach of German bombers, and within weeks they were up and running, producing tanks, rifles, and aircraft at astonishing rates. Civilians worked around the clock in freezing conditions. Young boys and old men joined the defense lines. Women became snipers, mechanics, and engineers. This was not a war of politics anymore. For the Soviet Union, it had become a war for survival. The German army split its forces into 3 major directions: north toward Leningrad, center toward Moscow, and south toward the resource-rich lands of Ukraine and the Caucasus. In the north, German forces surrounded Leningrad in a siege that would become one of the longest and most brutal in modern history. The city, cut off from food and supplies, endured nearly 900 days of hunger, cold, and relentless bombardment. People starved in the streets. Entire families froze in their apartments. And yet the city did not fall. Through sheer will and desperation, the people of Leningrad held on, and every day they survived became a quiet act of defiance. To the south, in Ukraine, Hitler sought the fertile lands and coal-rich Donbass region. The capture of Kiev was brutal and costly. But the true ambition lay further, toward the Caucasus, where oil fields could power the German war machine for years. It was there that a terrible, grinding campaign would eventually unfold. But the central focus, the symbolic and strategic prize, remained Moscow. By autumn, German forces approached the Soviet capital. Moscow's fall seemed inevitable. German soldiers could see the distant spires through their binoculars. Panic began to spread among the city's population. Trenches were dug in public parks, museums were emptied, and treasures hidden. Yet the final push never fully materialized. The autumn rains turned roads into rivers of mud. German tanks bogged down. Trucks became stranded, and then the snow began to fall. The German army had not prepared for a prolonged winter campaign. Many soldiers still wore summer uniforms. Oil froze in their engines. Weapons malfunctioned. Frostbite spread through the ranks. Temperatures plunged to unbearable lows, sometimes as cold as 40 degrees Celsius. Soviet forces, adapted to the weather and supplied with winter clothing and equipment, launched a counter-offensive. Fresh troops, including divisions from Siberia brought west after intelligence confirmed that Japan would not invade, arrived just in time. Outside Moscow, the German advance was halted, then pushed back. It was the first major defeat for Hitler's army in the east. The war was no longer a quick campaign. It had become a long, brutal slog. By 1942, Hitler remained determined to crush the Soviet Union. He believed that capturing the oil fields of the Caucasus would cripple Soviet industry and ensure German dominance. Thus began a new southern campaign, one that would culminate in one of the most harrowing and decisive battles of the entire war, the Battle of Stalingrad. Stalingrad was more than a city. It bore Stalin's name, a symbol of Soviet pride and resistance. Hitler wanted it taken not just for strategy, but for prestige. The battle began in the summer of 1942 and quickly devolved into an urban nightmare. Streets became front lines. Buildings turned into fortresses. Every block was contested. Soviet and German soldiers fought room to room, floor to floor, often with knives and grenades. Snipers haunted ruined factories. Smoke blanketed the city. The Volga River, once a symbol of trade and life, now ran red with blood. Winter returned, and with it came a trap. Soviet generals, led by Marshal Zhukov, launched Operation Uranus, a massive encirclement of German forces in the city. Cut off, surrounded, and freezing, the Sixth Army under General Paulus faced annihilation. Hitler ordered them to hold their ground, promising reinforcements that never came. Supplies were dropped from the air, but it wasn't enough. Disease spread, hunger devoured morale, and yet the order remained: no retreat. By February 1943, it was over. The remnants of the German Sixth Army surrendered. More than 90 German soldiers were taken prisoner. Only a fraction would ever return home. The loss at Stalingrad shattered the illusion of German invincibility. It marked the turning point of the war in the East. From that moment on, the Soviet Union would push westward, reclaiming territory mile by mile, city by city, in a brutal campaign of vengeance and liberation. But the cost was staggering. Entire towns were erased. Millions of civilians had perished. The Soviet Union bore the heaviest burden of the war, its cities reduced to rubble, its countryside scorched, its people broken by grief. Yet it endured. What began as a lightning invasion became a war of ice, steel, and unimaginable human sacrifice. And with each German retreat, with each battlefield reclaimed, the Soviet army drew closer to Berlin. The Eastern Front had become a monster that swallowed everything in its path. Not just armies, but entire landscapes, entire populations. It was not just war between two nations. It was a collision between ideologies, between two visions of the world, and neither side would stop until the other was crushed. The road to victory, though now visible, would be long, frozen, and soaked in blood. As the war reached deeper into its terrible middle years, the great armies clashed across frozen fields and jungle islands, across deserts and bomb-scarred cities, but beyond the front lines, beyond the tanks and planes and thunder of artillery, a different kind of war unfolded. It was a war waged in whispers and shadows, by ordinary people who refused to surrender to occupation, who risked everything to resist in whatever ways they could. In the towns and villages of France, Poland, Norway, Greece, and beyond, resistance movements began to form, not always coordinated, not always armed, but united in their refusal to bow entirely to the Axis powers. They were students, teachers, farmers, factory workers. They printed forbidden newspapers, sabotaged rail lines, hid fugitives in barns and basements, passed coded messages beneath the noses of patrols, and waited for the chance to strike a blow, however small, against the enemy that surrounded them. In France, the resistance grew slowly at first. After the fall of the country in 1940, the initial reaction for many was shock, disbelief, and then a desperate search for safety. But as the occupation deepened, and as the full cruelty of German control revealed itself, resistance became a necessity. Groups formed in secret, often isolated from one another, unsure who could be trusted. Radio operators tapped out messages to London in the dead of night. Couriers rode bicycles through the countryside with intelligence hidden in their handlebars. Women, often underestimated by the occupiers, became some of the most daring agents of all, slipping through checkpoints, delivering weapons, gathering information, helping downed Allied pilots find their way to safety. The risks were enormous. Capture meant torture, deportation, execution. Entire families vanished into prisons or camps because of a single betrayal. And yet the resistance grew stronger with each passing year. In Poland, resistance was a way of life. From the earliest days of occupation, the Polish underground formed one of the largest and most organized resistance movements in all of Europe. Known as the Home Army, they operated schools, published underground newspapers, and even maintained a secret government. But in Poland, resistance meant something more grim as well. It meant witnessing the early and brutal stages of the Holocaust. It meant seeing friends and neighbors dragged from their homes, seeing ghettos rise in the cities, and hearing rumors of camps from which no one returned. Resistance fighters smuggled food and medicine into the ghettos. They forged documents. They carried out assassinations of Nazi officials. In 1943, in the heart of Warsaw, the Jewish ghetto uprising erupted. Starving, desperate, armed with little more than pistols and Molotov cocktails, Jewish fighters held off the German army for weeks. They knew they would not win, but they chose how they would die, not in silence, but in defiance. In Denmark, a different kind of resistance flourished. When the Nazis began rounding up Danish Jews in 1943, word spread through the country's underground networks. In a remarkable and nearly unprecedented effort, over 7,000 Jews were ferried across the water to neutral Sweden, hidden in fishing boats under cover of darkness. Entire communities came together to save their neighbors. Doctors faked diagnoses to keep people in hospitals. Clergy offered church basements as shelters. Fishermen risked their lives to make the short but dangerous trip again and again. It was one of the war's quiet miracles, a reminder that compassion and courage could still triumph, even amid chaos. But not all resistance came from the occupied territories. Within the very heart of the Nazi Empire, there were those who risked everything to resist from within. In Germany itself, groups like the White Rose emerged, led by university students such as Hans and Sophie Scholl. They printed leaflets denouncing the regime, calling for an end to the war, urging fellow Germans to think, to question, to act. They were caught, interrogated, and executed, but their message endured, proof that even in the darkest places, voices of conscience refused to be silenced. And beyond the acts of resistance, far from the bombs and bullets, another horror unfolded, quiet, calculated, and monstrous in scale. The Holocaust, long rooted in Nazi ideology, entered its most brutal phase. What began with discrimination, with laws, with propaganda, had now become systematic extermination. Jews across Europe were forced into ghettos, cramped, walled-in sections of cities where starvation, disease, and violence were daily realities. Then came the deportations. Trains, packed with men, women, and children, rolled day and night to destinations few understood. Names like Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, Chelmno, at first unknown, would later become synonymous with death. At Auschwitz-Birkenau, the largest of the Nazi death camps, the process was terrifyingly efficient. Trains arrived at all hours. Families were herded from the cars, forced to stand in lines, examined briefly by officers who decided who would be worked to death and who would be killed immediately. Gas chambers, disguised as showers, were the end for millions. The belongings of the dead were sorted and stored: suitcases, shoes, eyeglasses, hair. Every piece of evidence catalogued the scale of the slaughter. By the end of the war, 6 million Jews had been murdered, along with millions of others: Roma, the disabled, political dissidents, homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, Soviet POWs, and countless civilians. And still, amid the horror, acts of resistance continued, even within the camps. Prisoners smuggled notes, sabotaged machinery, and in rare cases, launched uprisings. At Sobibor and Treblinka, revolts led to escapes. At Auschwitz, prisoners destroyed part of the crematorium with explosives smuggled in by women who worked in the munitions factory. These acts, though rarely successful in military terms, were statements of human will. They were reminders that even in places designed to strip away identity, dignity, and hope, people still found ways to fight back. The world outside the camps, for the most part, did not yet grasp the full extent of what was happening. Reports filtered through, vague, fragmented, sometimes dismissed as exaggerated. It would not be until the liberation of the camps in 1945 that the full scale of the genocide would be understood. Until then, the truth existed in the margins, in the testimony of escapees, in the desperate warnings of resistance networks, in the haunting absence left behind when entire communities simply vanished. Resistance, in all its forms, was not always grand or coordinated. It was often individual: a woman refusing to give up a neighbor, a priest hiding a child, a worker misplacing a shipment, a teenager tearing down a poster. These moments, small on their own, became part of something larger, a collective refusal to accept evil as normal. They didn't stop the war, but they reminded the world that the human spirit could endure, even in the darkest hour. By late 1943 and into 1944, as Allied forces began planning major offensives to liberate Europe, these resistance movements would become even more vital. They provided intelligence, disrupted communications, and guided advancing troops through enemy territory. But in these years before liberation, before victory, when the outcome was still uncertain and fear was a daily companion, they stood largely alone, and they stood anyway. This was the war beyond the front lines, the war in attics and alleyways, in forests and farmhouses, in the hearts of people who chose risk over silence. It was not fought with tanks or fleets, but with courage, cunning, and the quiet belief that freedom, though distant, was still worth reaching for, and it was fought every single day. By the spring of 1944, the great machinery of war was shifting again, and this time, it was pointing directly at the heart of occupied Europe. The Allies, Britain, the United States, the Soviet Union, and their partners, had spent years fighting to halt the Axis tide. They had held the skies above Britain, pushed the Japanese back from Pacific strongholds, and turned back the Nazi advance on the Eastern Front. But the time had come to do more than hold and defend. The time had come to liberate. And to do that, the Allies would have to do something that no force in history had successfully done. They would have to land a vast army on the heavily fortified coasts of Western Europe, breach Hitler's Atlantic Wall, and begin the long, grinding path toward Berlin. That plan was given a name, Operation Overlord, and it would begin on the beaches of Normandy. For months, the preparations unfolded in secrecy and in scale almost unimaginable. Ports in southern England brimmed with ships of every kind. Soldiers from across the Allied nations, Americans, British, Canadians, Free French, Poles, trained together, rehearsing landings, learning to navigate through obstacles, and preparing for the fight that lay ahead. Engineers built artificial harbors. Codebreakers worked feverishly to keep German attention fixed elsewhere. A vast deception campaign, codenamed Operation Fortitude, was launched to convince the Germans that the real invasion would come at Calais, not Normandy. Inflatable tanks were placed in fields. Fake radio traffic buzzed with meaningless chatter. General Patton, famously aggressive and theatrical, was made the apparent commander of the fake invasion force to keep German attention occupied. And the deception worked. When the true invasion began, Hitler's forces were still waiting in the wrong place. In the early hours of June 6, 1944 day, the first phase began. Allied paratroopers, dropped behind enemy lines in the darkness, landed in hedgerows, marshes, and villages across Normandy. Their mission was chaos: seize bridges, cut communications, block reinforcements. The night was chaotic, the landings scattered, but many of the key objectives were achieved. Then, just before dawn, the sea filled with ships, thousands of them. The largest amphibious invasion in human history was underway. Along a 50-mile stretch of coastline, 5 beaches were targeted: Utah and Omaha for the Americans, Golden Sword for the British, and Juno for the Canadians. Each beach had its own terrain, its own defenders, its own challenges, and on each, men stepped from landing craft into a storm of bullets and fear. At Omaha, the bloodiest of the landings, American forces faced steep cliffs, well-entrenched German machine guns, and a killing field of sand and steel. Boats were torn apart before they touched the shore. Soldiers waded through water filled with bodies and equipment. For hours, the battle hung in the balance. But by day's end, the beaches were in Allied hands. The price was staggering: over 0 casualties on the first day alone, but the foothold in France had been secured. From that point forward, the liberation of Western Europe began in earnest. The fighting in Normandy was fierce, slow, and often measured in yards, not miles. Hedgerows turned fields into natural fortresses. German snipers and tanks made every advance costly. Towns were reduced to rubble and then fought over street by street. But the Allies pressed on. American, British, and Canadian troops fought side by side, supported by air power that dominated the skies and a logistics network that kept supplies flowing across the Channel. Slowly, German forces were pushed back. By late August, Paris itself was liberated. French resistance fighters, emboldened by the Allied advance, had risen up inside the city, engaging German forces and welcoming the Free French troops who arrived shortly after. After 4 long years, the French capital was free again. But even as Europe was being reclaimed from the West, another campaign was underway in the South. In Italy, Allied forces had landed the year before, in 1943, following the surrender of Mussolini's regime, but the German army had quickly moved in to occupy the peninsula and resist the Allied advance. The fighting in Italy was bitter and difficult, fought through mountains and valleys, against well-prepared German defenses. Cities like Monte Cassino were devastated. Rain turned roads into mud. Progress was slow. Rome was liberated in June 1944, but the rest of northern Italy would take months more to secure. Meanwhile, in the east, the Soviet Union was unleashing its full might. After the victory at Stalingrad and the grinding push westward through Ukraine, Soviet forces launched Operation Bagration in the summer of 1944, a massive offensive that smashed the German Army Group Center and liberated vast swaths of Belarus. The Red Army moved like a tidal wave, reclaiming territory and pushing relentlessly toward Poland and the borders of the Reich. The Germans were now fighting a war on two fronts again, something Hitler had always feared and promised to avoid. Now it was reality, and the pressure was building from all sides. In the Pacific too, the war was escalating. After victories in places like Guadalcanal and the Gilbert Islands, Allied forces had begun a brutal campaign through the Marianas and the Philippines. At Saipan, at Guam, at Leyte Gulf, the United States fought to reclaim territory and move ever closer to Japan. The fighting was brutal, marked by kamikaze attacks, jungle warfare, and fanatical resistance. But each island captured brought the Allies one step nearer to the Japanese mainland. But victory in the Pacific would not come quickly. Japan had prepared for a long and bloody defense, and even as American bombers reached the home islands, the spirit of resistance only seemed to grow. The battles to come, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, would be among the most costly of the entire war. Yet in late 1944, the attention of the world turned again to Europe. Hitler, desperate to reverse his fortunes, launched a final surprise offensive in the west, through the Ardennes forest in Belgium. The aim was to split the Allied forces and recapture the port of Antwerp, throwing the entire Western campaign into disarray. The offensive began in December, under the cover of snow and mist, and struck with ferocious force. American units were caught off guard. Some were surrounded. Others held desperately, like those in the town of Bastogne, encircled and under siege. This became known as the Battle of the Bulge, the last great German offensive of the war in the West. It was a moment of extreme danger, but also one of remarkable endurance. American forces held their ground. The weather cleared, Allied air power returned, and reinforcements poured in. Within weeks, the German advance was halted and then reversed. The bulge in the front line was pushed back, and the Wehrmacht had spent the last of its strength. From that point on, the German retreat became irreversible. As the winter of 1944 turned to 1945, Allied forces closed in on Germany from both east and west. Bombers struck deep into the heart of the Reich. Railways, factories, and cities were left in ruins. German civilians began to flee. Refugees poured into towns already overwhelmed. Fear, hunger, and exhaustion filled the air. The regime that had promised a 1,000-year Reich now clung to a crumbling illusion. Hitler withdrew to his bunker beneath Berlin. Around him, the world he built was falling apart. But the end had not yet come, and for those still fighting, still waiting in occupied towns, still surviving in camps and shelters, every day of delay meant more pain, more loss. The liberation was close, but the final chapter would be its own kind of storm, and the world braced itself for what would come next. By early 1945, the weight of the war had fallen almost entirely upon Germany. The once mighty Reich, which had stretched from the Atlantic to the gates of Moscow, was crumbling under relentless pressure. To the west, Allied armies surged across France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, pushing through the Siegfried Line and into the heart of Germany. To the east, the Soviet Union advanced with overwhelming force, sweeping through Poland, Hungary, and the Balkans, now just weeks away from Berlin. The country itself was collapsing inward, cities reduced to rubble, roads clogged with refugees, and factories operating on fumes. The dream of conquest had long since turned into a nightmare of survival. But even with defeat on the horizon, Hitler refused to surrender. He retreated deeper into delusion, issuing orders to imaginary armies, demanding counterattacks that no longer had the men or equipment to succeed. Around him, his most loyal followers clung to a world that no longer existed, trapped in the fantasy of victory, while reality closed in with steel and fire. Across the bombed-out cities of Germany, daily life had become a fight against despair. Air raids were constant. The sound of sirens, once terrifying, had become routine. Families slept in basements and shelters. Children grew up never knowing anything but war. Food was scarce, electricity unreliable, and hope distant. The German people, once promised glory and prosperity, were now left to endure a war that had turned their country into a battlefield. Some still believed the propaganda that spoke of secret weapons and miraculous victories. Others saw the truth written clearly in every smoking ruin and empty chair. And still, the war dragged on. The Allies, while united in their goal to end the war, faced difficult decisions as they closed in on Berlin. The Yalta Conference, held in February 1945, brought together the leaders of the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin. There, in the cold halls of a Crimean palace, they began to divide the post-war world before the final shot had been fired. Agreements were made about spheres of influence, the future of Germany, and the fate of Eastern Europe. But beneath the handshakes and signatures lay tensions that would not remain buried for long. Even in cooperation, mistrust simmered. The war was not yet over, but already the seeds of the Cold War were being planted. On the ground, the fighting grew fiercer as the Allies neared the German capital. In the east, the Soviet Red Army began the final push toward Berlin in April. The Battle of Berlin would be the last and bloodiest assault in the European theater. Soviet artillery opened up with a barrage that turned the city into an inferno. Buildings collapsed. Streets became rivers of debris. House by house, block by block, the Red Army fought its way into the capital, meeting fanatical resistance from what remained of the German army, the SS, and even child soldiers pressed into service by a regime in its death throes. Civilians cowered in basements. Some fled westward, desperate to avoid capture by the Soviets, fearing retribution for the suffering inflicted on Russia. Their fears were not unfounded. Years of horror, murder, and devastation had hardened the Soviet troops, and while many maintained discipline, others sought vengeance. The end was not clean. It was chaotic, violent, and steeped in tragedy. Inside the Führer bunker beneath Berlin, Hitler watched his empire collapse from concrete chambers deep below ground. Surrounded by a shrinking circle of advisors, he continued to issue orders that bore no connection to the reality outside. He married his longtime companion, Eva Braun, in a brief and quiet ceremony. Less than 40 hours later, both took their own lives. Their bodies were burned in a garden behind the bunker, as the Soviets closed in just blocks away. With their deaths, the myth of the unshakable Reich was shattered. The man who had once rallied millions with promises of greatness died underground, abandoned by the very world he had sworn to rule. Shortly after Hitler's death, German forces began to surrender in waves. On May 7th, 1945, Germany signed an unconditional surrender at Reims, France. The next day, a second formal surrender was signed in Berlin, satisfying Stalin's demand that the ceremony take place in the capital conquered by his armies. May 8th was declared Victory in Europe Day, VE Day. Across the Allied nations, people flooded the streets. Church bells rang, strangers embraced, flags waved in the wind, and for a few brief hours, the world allowed itself to breathe. But even in celebration, there was sorrow. Cities lay in ruin. Millions were dead. Families torn apart would never be made whole again. The war had ended in Europe, but its scars would remain for generations. The liberation of the concentration camps in those final months had revealed the full scale of the Holocaust. Allied soldiers, hardened by years of combat, wept openly at what they saw. Bodies piled in ditches, survivors reduced to skin and bone, the machinery of death left behind in quiet horror. Entire towns and villages had been erased, and entire people had been targeted for extinction. And though the fighting was over, the weight of what had been uncovered had only begun to settle in. In Germany, the aftermath brought occupation, justice, and reckoning. The country was divided into zones controlled by the Allies. The Nuremberg trials would soon follow, holding high-ranking Nazis accountable for war crimes and crimes against humanity. The excuses of following orders and ignorance were no longer enough. The world had witnessed the results of unchecked power, blind obedience, and racial hatred, and now it demanded answers. In Italy, Benito Mussolini, Hitler's one-time ally, had already met a violent end. Captured while trying to flee north, he was executed by Italian partisans. His body, along with his mistresses, was hung in a public square in Milan, a stark warning of what awaited those who had brought ruin to their nations. Fascism had fallen, but its legacy was written in ashes. The victory in Europe brought an end to one chapter of the war, but the world remained engulfed in conflict. Across the Pacific, Japan continued to fight with grim determination. The battles ahead, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and eventually Hiroshima and Nagasaki, would be among the most devastating yet. Millions of soldiers were still deployed. Millions more civilians still lived under the shadow of war. The final end had not yet come. But in Europe, after 6 long years of terror, resistance, and unimaginable sacrifice, peace had finally returned. Not a peaceful peace, not a celebratory one, but a peace built from ruin. A peace that came not with parades, but with silence. And in that silence, the world began to wonder what might grow from the rubble. In the days and weeks that followed the collapse of the Third Reich, Europe found itself suspended in an uneasy quiet. The guns had finally fallen silent, but the silence was not the triumphant one so many had imagined. It was heavy, filled with dust, with grief, with questions. Cities once teeming with life now stood hollowed out, their buildings reduced to skeletons, their streets littered with rubble and memory. Berlin, Warsaw, Stalingrad, Rotterdam, London, each bore the scars of fire and steel, of years lived in terror. The survivors emerged from bunkers, cellars, forests, and refugee camps with eyes that had seen too much. They stepped into the broken sunlight of a continent that no longer looked like home, where entire neighborhoods had vanished, and old friends had been lost without farewell. There was no map for this new world. The war had ended, but its shadow lingered. In Germany, occupation forces moved quickly to restore order. The country had been divided into 4 zones, each controlled by one of the major Allied powers: the United States, the Soviet Union, Britain, and France. Soldiers who had once stormed beaches and charged trenches were now tasked with guarding roads, organizing food shipments, and managing millions of displaced people. There were families who had fled the east to escape the Soviet advance, survivors from concentration camps who had nowhere left to go, orphaned children wandering alone, prisoners of war returning to find their homes erased. The scale of human movement was unlike anything seen before. Trains now carried not soldiers, but refugees. Camps were erected for the homeless, the stateless, the forgotten. The world had seen destruction before, but never on this scale, and never so completely entwined with the very structure of society. Infrastructure had collapsed, farmlands lay fallow, railroads were twisted wrecks, governments no longer existed in many places, and those that did were paralyzed. Industry had been redirected toward death for so long that it no longer knew how to make anything else. The task ahead was not just to rebuild, but to redefine, and at the heart of this monumental effort stood a need not only for recovery, but for justice. In the Bavarian city of Nuremberg, a courtroom was prepared to host a trial that would change the world. The Nazi leadership, those who had survived the war and been captured, were brought to stand before the judgment of the Allied powers and, more symbolically, before the judgment of history itself. Charges were read: crimes against peace, war crimes, crimes against humanity. Evidence was presented not only in documents and testimonies, but in film reels, photographs, and eyewitness accounts that forced the world to confront the depth of what had been done. The horrors of Auschwitz, of Treblinka, of Dachau were laid bare. The defense, often hollow, claimed obedience, ignorance, necessity. The tribunal answered with sentences, and some of the most infamous names of the Nazi regime were sentenced to death. Others would spend their remaining years in prison. The Nuremberg trials established a precedent that leaders could be held accountable for their actions in war, that state power did not excuse atrocity, and that the world had a responsibility to remember and to act. While Germany faced judgment and occupation, the rest of Europe tried to find its footing. France emerged from occupation deeply scarred, both physically and politically. The resistance was celebrated, but questions lingered about who had collaborated, who had looked away, and who had quietly survived by adapting to the demands of war. Italy, no longer fascist, was now a republic, its monarchy discarded in the wake of Mussolini's fall. Eastern Europe, however, found its future shaped not by liberation, but by the advancing hand of Soviet power. Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, one by one, they fell behind what Churchill would later call the Iron Curtain. Elections were held, but often with only one permitted outcome. A new order was rising, not under Hitler's boot, but beneath Stalin's shadow. And still, the world's eyes were drawn east, to the Pacific, where the war continued with relentless intensity. Even after the German surrender, Japan fought on. The battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa had revealed a terrifying reality that Japan would not yield easily. Soldiers and civilians alike chose death over surrender. Kamikaze pilots hurled themselves at Allied ships. Resistance was not a strategy, it was a creed. The United States prepared for an invasion of the Japanese mainland, a campaign expected to cost hundreds of thousands of lives on both sides. But the world would not reach that point. In August of 1945, 2 American bombers took off from airfields in the Pacific, each carrying a single, terrible weapon. On August 6th, Hiroshima was destroyed in a flash of light and fire. 3 days later, Nagasaki suffered the same fate. Tens of thousands died instantly. More followed in the days, weeks, and years to come from burns, radiation, and disease. Japan, stunned and broken, surrendered on August 15th. The war, at last, was over. But what followed the end was not peace, not in the way people had imagined. It was something more fragile, a global exhale, a cautious rebuilding, a world blinking in the light after years spent in darkness. The United Nations was born in this moment, not just as an institution, but as an idea, a hope that nations, having witnessed what war could become, might find ways to resolve conflict before it spread like fire. The UN Charter was signed in June of 1945, laying the foundation for international cooperation, diplomacy, and perhaps preventing the next global catastrophe. Yet peace remained elusive. In many places, war had simply changed shape. Colonial empires, weakened by years of fighting, now faced demands for independence. In India, Vietnam, Algeria, and across Africa, new conflicts began, fueled by old grievances and new resolve. In Germany and the Soviet-occupied territories, families were torn apart, not by bombs, but by borders and ideology. Berlin itself, the symbol of the old war's end, was now divided, its streets watched by soldiers not of enemy armies, but former allies. The Cold War had begun, quiet at first, but ever present. A world once united by a common enemy was now split by mistrust, by nuclear tension, by the fear that the next war could come not with invasion, but with instant, global annihilation. Still, amid the ashes, there were signs of something better. Europe began to rebuild. The Marshall Plan brought American aid to shattered economies. Cities were reconstructed brick by brick. Families, broken by loss, began to form new bonds. Displaced persons, after years of wandering, were resettled. New nations emerged, new leaders rose, and across the world, people began to dream again, not of empire or conquest, but of stability, education, health, and peace. Children returned to school, artists picked up their brushes, scientists pursued discovery not for war, but for progress. And everywhere, the memory of what had happened lingered like smoke, not to choke, but to remind. For those who had lived through the war, the years that followed were haunted not only by what they had seen, but by the constant question of how such things could have happened, how millions could be murdered, how ordinary people could be swept into systems of cruelty, how easily truth could be buried beneath flags and slogans. These questions would echo for decades, through books, through trials, through education, and through silence. They would shape how nations taught their history, how societies remembered their dead, and how people watched the world for signs that such darkness might rise again. The Second World War had begun with ambition, pride, and a thirst for domination. It ended with silence, with ashes, and with a world forever altered. Borders had shifted, empires had collapsed. Tens of millions were dead. But amid the ruins, life persisted, love returned, music played, crops grew. And slowly, the world moved forward, not the same, never the same, but still moving, still breathing, still trying to make sense of it all. And somewhere, beneath a quiet sky, a mother told her child a bedtime story, not of war, but of hope, a story that began not with fire, but with light. A promise that even after the longest night, the sun still rises and always will.